With that, I'm going to move down on the agenda items here and pass it over to our first presenter, which is Christian Kirk, and I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself, and he'll be providing the presentation on performance evaluation audits. So welcome, Christian.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Tams, for inviting me on. I've got two presentations that I'll share with you. One is talking about the performance audits that your air monitoring programs may be subject to. And then the second presentation is going to be on the updates to ozone transfer standards that were published last year, which changed how ozone measurements the traceability is done. So first question is, what are performance audits? Well, they're pretty much your independent QA activities, and they're used to assess bias. And as the main 40 CFR Part 58 Appendix A, which governs most of QA, defines that as that systematic or persistent distortion in the measurement process. And equation one is right out of Appendix A, and that's pretty much the primary calculation for almost all of the calculations. So it's simply your measured value from the instrument under audit, subtract out the audit measurement divided by the audit measurement times 100 to calculate your percent difference. So yeah, for almost all of the audit measurements here, it's going to be your measured response from the instrument is going to be compared to a known value, which is determined by the auditor. For auditing, there is a level of independence that's required. EPA frequently uses the terminologies of shall or must for requirement, should for recommendation, and may for something that's optional or discretionary. In the CFR, personnel conducting the audit should not be the routine site operator. So I think they understand for small organizations, there's not a lot of personnel. So having independent personnel is going to be difficult for performing the audits. Again, they say that the personnel conducting the audit should be trained and experienced as an auditor. Lastly, any standards or equipment used in audits must be different than those used for routine operations and measurements. Now, other EPA guidance or the regions may impose some other requirements on top of these, but these are the requirements out of the CFR. Here's a variety of different types of performance audits that your monitoring network may be subject to, and then the relevant reference. The ones that are in bold are the ones I'm going to kind of go over today, and probably the ones that are most likely your networks will be subject to. The first set of audits, which are labeled as internal or PKAO, are the audits that your organization should be implementing yourselves, while the remaining three at the bottom are the ones that EPA will implement and provide resources and personnel for. So the annual performance evaluation for our criteria pollutant gases, also known as APE, that's the responsibility of the PQAO or their contractor to perform these audits. Again, everything here is NIST traceable, so there has to be an independent NIST traceable ozone standard for the ozone audits. And then obviously we need our EPA protocol NIST traceable gas cylinders for our sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide audits. Those cylinders are diluted to known concentrations using a gas solution calibrator and a zero-error supply. The requirements of this is that 25% of your network needs to be audited quarterly, or each site once per year for networks smaller than 4 sites. Now, this changed. It used to be that if you only had one site, in order to meet the 25% network requirement, that same site would have to be audited every quarter. That's no longer the requirement. These are all the audit levels for auditing the criteria pollutant gases. The CFR specifies that 3 of the audit levels must be first, run at levels 1, which is 2 to 3 times your MDL. Secondly, they want an audit concentration that's within 99th percentile of your data. And the third one gives you leeway. It can be at the max or your highest 3-year concentration or whatever you deem is important for your program. A fourth level is encouraged. And the highlighted levels here are typically audit levels that we use here at EPA Region 8. That's the region I'm based out of. I do a fair amount of work in Region 8. And once you're outside of urban areas, these 4 audit levels, 2 through 5, is typically what we run for all our audits. The acceptance criteria for all the audits are as listed. Level 1 and level 2 are 50% or a fixed amount of ppb. I already see an error here. CO should be plus or minus 30 ppb because that's measured in ppm. And then all the other upper levels are plus or minus 15%. Failures at the audit level 1 and 2 are not considered punitive, meaning EPA is not necessarily going to require that your data be invalidated because an audit was failed at those levels. Failures at these lower levels are usually the result of zero response offsets. So you should include a zero challenge in your audit. And the calculation is simply, the analyzer response minus the audit concentration divided by the audit concentration times 100. That gives you your percent difference. So audits for APEs are typically conducted what's known as back of analyzer or BOA. You still need to make sure that the analyzer is in your normal sampling mode and that you're sending your audit gases through all your filters, scrubbers, conditioners, etc. And that's listed in the CFR. That's 3.1.23 in Appendix A. It is recommended that you flood your sampling manifold to test integrity of as much of the sampling system as possible. And this will allow you to actually audit multiple gas analyzers simultaneously as well, which will save time. Next, we'll talk about the semi-annual flow rate audit requirements for 2.5, PM 2.5, and PM 10. Again, this is a PQAO level requirement. NIST traceable flow standards are required. Even though it's listed as semi-annual, meaning twice a year, EPA wants those audits to occur between 5 and 7 months. Of course, they also recommend more frequent auditing than that. Along with the flow audits, it's recommended that the instrument temperature and pressure measurements are audited with NIST traceable standards. And this applies to all FRM and FEM instruments. So here are the requirements for conducting the audit. The temperature of the sampler that it measures must be plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius, barometric pressure plus or minus 10 millimeters of mercury. And then depending on whether you're talking about PM 2.5, PM 10, or PM 10 high volume, there's a specification listed. And you'll notice there's an audit flow and a design flow calculation. For design flow calculations, you'll use the same equation, but you'll substitute the design flow for the audit flow. And the reason you do this is the design flow is critical for size selective inlets. For example, most PM10 inlets you're probably familiar with are designed for 16.7 liters per minute. If you deviate far from that, you won't get the proper size cut. I'll give you an example here. Let's say we're auditing a MET1 BAM 1020 PM10. You show up, you find the instrument flow is 15 liters per minute. Your audit standard agrees, it's 15 liters per minute. 0% difference. Great, right? Well, if you do the design flow calculation, you'll see that actually, while the instrument's reporting accurate flow, it's not at the right flow. It's actually more than 10% off of the design flow, and this is actually an audit failure. So it's important for instruments with size cuts that the flow audit encompass both comparison to the audit standard and comparison to the design flow of the instrument. Semi-annual flow rate audit for lead. I'm not sure how many of the networks you guys are involved with run for lead. There's pretty much no regulatory lead monitoring in Region 8. But for semi-annual flow rates, it follows a similar pattern as the PM 2.5 and PM 10. It's required at the PQAO level, NIST traceable flow standards, audits between 5 and 7 months apart. Of course, more frequently is recommended. And then the requirements will depend on whether you're using a low volume PM10 sampler or a high volume TSP. I think most people do high volume TSP now because it gives you a much lower limit of detection for lead. Similar temperature pressure requirements. Obviously, the PM10 flow low volume has an audit flow and design criteria which mimics that of PM 2.5. However, TSP, there is no size cut. So therefore, there is no design flow calculation required, only the audit flow to the actual sampler flow. Next, I'll move on to the national EPA run programs. The first one is what we call NPAP, National Performance Audit Program. This is your criteria pollutant gases. Each EPA region or their contractors required for performing these audits. Again, NIST traceable ozone standards, EPA protocol gases, dilution of known gases down to known concentrations to deliver audit concentrations. EPA is required to audit 20% of your network annually, and they have to be sure to hit 100% of your network every 6 years. If you have only one site, that means EPA is visiting every year to conduct this audit. Again, the same audit levels are going to be used by EPA as the APE audits. And typically I find that audits level 2 to 5 in region 8 are what are run. EPA will perform a level 1 or level 2 audit as one of the audit levels. And again, that failures of those levels is not considered punitive. All the requirements are same, except for ozone is much tighter. Ozone is a plus or minus 10% requirement. And again, I'll correct this spreadsheet before I give it over to Mike, but it's not plus or minus 15% or 1.5 ppb for CO. That should be 30 ppb for that. Again, same equation, measurement minus audit divided by audit times 100 to give our percent differences. The unique feature about the NPAP program is all audits are conducted through the probe. Pretty much EPA delivers all the gas at your sampling inlet to challenge your entire sampling system. So, and I've seen this firsthand where analyzers could be spot on, but because of dirt or leaks in the manifold, they fail the audit. And that helps this type of audit helps identify those type of issues. And auditors are required to attend training annually and are certified by EPA. EPA has a national training for this program and the next program I'm about to mention every year. Now we're going to talk about the EPA 2.5 Performance Evaluation Program, or PEP. Again, each EPA region is required for this to conduct these audits. It involves co-locating an FRM with your site PM 2.5 instrument and collecting a 24-hour sample. And so 24-hour samples from the audit and from the site are then compared. If your network has 5 or less PM 2.5 sites, EPA will come out 5 times to conduct audits. If you have more than 5 sites, then there'll be 8 audits. And the goal is EPA wants to basically audit 100% of your network over 6 years. Audits for this type are only valid if the 24-hour concentrations equal to or greater than 2 micrograms per cubic meter. And then this is the equation that's used to determine whether or not the audit passes. And this is not on a case by case. This is aggregating all the audits that are conducted on an annual basis to do this calculation. Now, if this calculation looks really weird, it's because it is, and it's actually brand new. It's one of the many 2.5 regulations that were promulgated on May 6th, which includes lowering the NACs for PM 2.5. Now you may say, what about other measurements that are not criteria pollutants and not governed by the CFR? Well, other networks certainly do have their own requirements. EPA has a bunch of other networks like the chemical speciation network, the improved network, and basically the NATS network, where they have audit requirements listed in their QAPs in order to accommodate this quality assurance requirement. So if your network is making measurements that are not does not fall under these categories of criteria pollutants, you should be addressing some kind of performance audits for these instruments. For example, some of you might be making hydrogen sulfide measurements or methane, non-methane measurements with continuous analyzers. Well, those can be audited in a similar fashion to the criteria pollutants, and you should implement those and address those in your QAP. Then here's a list of references that will pretty much where I grabbed all that information from. I was a performance auditor here at ARS for approximately 10, 12 years. And we also at ARS run the EPA Region 8 MPAP and PEP contracts. So we do all of this work on a regular basis. I think now would be a good time to open up to some questions before I move on to the next presentation.
Great. Thanks, Christian. Is there any questions from anyone? I'll check the chat too as well. We got a question from Kurt Lyons. Go ahead, Kurt.
My mic was on. Is there a update to a QA handbook for the new PM 2.5 level, the change to the minimum level, and to that equation that you showed a couple slides back?
Let me bring that up. Now that equation is not something you'll need to worry about. That's an equation that EPA will conduct on the PEP data. But there is actually a similar equation for the PQAOs to handle their co-located data, because there should be some level of co-location for your 2.5 networks. That's in the CFR. I do not believe there's been an update to QA Handbook Volume 2 recently. I think the most recent one is still 2017. I'll have to double check that, but no, you will not see a new. This was just promulgated on May, so there's not a new handbook, QA handbook that will handle all of this yet. But certainly, if you find the Federal Register where this is published, there's an explanation, and it is in the CFR now. If you go to like the electronic CFR that the federal government has. Did I answer all your questions? Sorry.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kurt. And that question is really important because that's some of the information we'd like to share at the upcoming PM monitoring course that we'll be having at the TAM Center this coming fall. So thank you. Any other questions, guys, from anyone? Feel free to unmute yourself and provide your question.
Hey guys, this is Chris. Christian.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your information, and I asked this question just to make it aware to all the tribes, I guess. So you spoke of the EPA monitoring programs such as the NPAP and the PEP. So these programs, if a tribe is doing for informational purposes type monitoring rather than regulatory monitoring, are they still required to do these kinds of audits?
No, EPA will not come do audits for non-regulatory networks, but you still should be doing your semi-annual flow audits and things of that nature that's required at the PQAO level. That's what EPA is going to want to see. They're going to want to see some level of QA activity, even if it's non-regulatory.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, just a quick clarification as well. So I call these the federal audits, the EPA National Performance Evaluation Programs. In regards to the independent audits as well, as Christian is referring to, typically those can be done by someone that's not the site operator to perform those audits, which, as Christian mentioned, those are like your QC checks that you would do and report to EPA. All right. Any other questions, guys? Not seeing anything in the chat right now. So I guess Christian, if you want to transition to your next presentation,
Yeah.
go ahead and queue up again.
I'm going to briefly go over changes to the ozone transfer standard verification. The TAD was recently, the published date is January 2023, but I don't think it became public available till later in the year. Quick refresher, ozone transfer standards are what provide our NIST traceability for all our ozone measurements.
Hey,
With proper
Christian.
Sorry?
Sorry, Christian. We're still seeing your
Huh.
previous presentation. If you want to reshare your screen, and then
Yep, sorry about that.
no worries.
Let's try that. How's that?
Perfect. We can see it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that. So ozone transfer standards are what provide our NIST traceability for all our ozone measurements. So utilizing our proper procedures, not only are ozone measurements at different sites going to be comparable, but that's going to allow us to make comparisons against the NACs. And so my little chart here to the left, which is a little hard to see, is our traceability from the International Bureau of Weights and Measures all the way down to the EPA regional level. And these are all SRP, standard reference photometers, which you may be familiar with when dealing with at the regional level. And I believe those SRP 2728, which are like quote unquote the God standards, reside in France. So basically, the whole world, if you're making ozone measurements the right way, everyone's traceable back to an original set of standards. And that's what makes all the ozone data intercomparable, and then we can actually compare it against the NACs and make decisions from good quality data. So the old ozone transfer standard scheme was as follows. Basically, you had an EPA regional SRP, which was used to basically verify an organization's level 2 transfer standard. And then from there, there was either a level 3 or level 4 if necessary for the transfer standard, which then was ultimately used to calibrate the on-site ozone analyzer. So depending on the size of your organization, maybe you only had a level 2 and that was used to calibrate and check the ozone analyzer, or maybe you had a level 3 or level 4, etc. But this was the old scheme. 6x6 verifications, if you're not familiar, are referring to these 1x6s that are done on 6 different days and then calculating relevant statistics. And that 1x6 refers to comparing the lower level transfer standard to the higher level transfer standard at 6 evenly spaced points or more, including 0 and basically 90% of the full scale of the transfer standard. So in order to verify a new or repaired instrument, it would take you at least 6 days. They don't have to be consecutive days, but it would take you at least 6 days to go through the verification process. So why did EPA want to make changes? Well, they wanted to lower the ozone measurement uncertainty, which would ultimately improve our data. So one thing they did is they effectively eliminated level 4 transfer standards. This language of strongly discouraged is directly out of the new TAD, which means talk to EPA. Also, ozone generators, meaning instruments that did not have photometers and make ozone measurements, are no longer acceptable as transfer standards. And then they made changes to the re-verification schedules and the calculated statistics. So the new ozone transfer standard scheme looks like this. There's only 3 levels of transfer standard: level 1 SRP, the level 2 and level 3 if necessary at the PQAO level. But then level 2 and level 3 can be designated as either a field or bench transfer standard. It's kind of self-explanatory. Once you have a bench standard, it sits in your laboratory, doesn't move, whereas the field transfer standard is something that you take to the field with you. So this is kind of the generic scheme that EPA came up with. We'll zoom in on that. So you can see there's kind of multiple pathways here. It makes it a little confusing. The different ways things can be verified or re-verified. Basically, all level 2s must be verified against the SRP, either annually or if they failed any re-verification. All level 2 field standards must be re-verified every 6 months, but that can be done either against the SRP or a bench level 2. Now that seems a little strange for a level 2 to be re-verified against another level 2. That's one of the big changes EPA has done here. All level 3 transfer standards now must be initially verified against that level 2 bench. That's over here on pathway 3. Next, all level 3 field standards must be re-verified against a level 2 bench every 6 months. And then all level 3 bench standards must be re-verified annually, but that can be done against a level 2 bench or level 2 field or level 3 field. So level 2, level 3 verification requirements. I mentioned before, it used to be this 6x6 that occurred over 6 days. Well, now it can be a 3x6 that occurs all in the same day. So when you send your level 2 to EPA, they should be able to get it all done in one day and then send the instrument back to you. If you're verifying your own level 3, you can do that all in one day. So yeah, level 2s are always verified initially against the level 1 SRP. All level 3s are verified against a level 2 initially. And here are the calculations. The changes are relatively minor, and there's nothing here that's difficult to calculate. It's just percent differences of each point, and then looking at slopes and intercepts of your 1x6s, and then calculating the standard deviation of those 3 slopes or 3 intercepts from the 3x6. For level 3 bench re-verification, this only needs to be performed annually, and it can be, like I said, performed against a level 2 field or level 3 field standard. Most of the calculations are essentially the same. For level 2 and level 3 field re-verifications, they're performed every 6 months against a level 2 bench. And again, those calculations are all the same. So my next question, does this seem pretty complicated, confusing? It does. But you can break this thing down to something similar by understanding the size of your organization, by the number of ozone monitoring stations you have. Quite simply, if you only have one site, which is pretty common, you only need one level 2 bench standard that EPA will verify annually, and you'd leave it at your monitoring location. Do you have a couple sites where you manually conduct your zero span 1.QC checks by visiting the sites every 14 days? Well, then one level 2 field standard will probably work for you, except EPA will need to see that semi-annually. Or do you have a bunch of level 3 bench standards that sit at your site and run automated checks for your span 1.QC checks? Well, you might have one level bench standard that's verified annually, and then one level 2 field standard that you take to the field to challenge those level 3s. So even though it's complicated, EPA has provided a very flexible pathway to accommodating how your network is set up. And the best thing to do is, if you're confused, is work with EPA to understand how to best set up your ozone traceability. Here at ARS, since we're a consultant, we're basically an extension of a variety different of PQAOs. And we have 2 bench level 2s, because we have one that's for our maintenance and calibration group, and we've got one for our audit group so that we can be independent. Under the maintenance and calibration group, we now have 6 level 2 field standards to take to the field, and we only have level 3 bench standards in the field. And on the QA audit side, I mentioned the level 2 bench, and then we have 2 level 3 field standards. And then we also have 2 more level 2 field standards that are specific to the EPA MPAP program. So there's also an additional level of different traceability between our maintenance and calibration group and our audit group. And so basically I just used both versions of the EPA transfer standard TADs to kind of compare the differences, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Christian. Again, open for questions. I'm going to check the chat box again real quick.
Hey, Mike, this is Leroy. I have some add-ons to that. You
Sure,
hear me?
Leroy, go ahead. Yep, go ahead, Leroy.
Yeah. Kristen, can you put on the flow chart with the pathways of verifications?
What?
Yeah. Just recently, we've been revising our QAP for ozone, and the QA office from Region 9 recommended that we have 2 level 2 bench standards or level 2 standards. We only had one, and it was a primary standard without a generator. It was okay, but her comment was verifying your level 2 standard after transportation or after receiving it back from CARB with its verification. So, they were basically saying, we need another standard to say that stays at the location, at the site here in Saskatoon, and then when that verified standard that comes back from CARB, the annual verification, that needs to be re-verified just because, it was transported back to GRIC from CARB. So that was one of their comments, and, that basically puts us in a position to where we have to purchase another level 2 standard. And, our level 2 is basically our bench standard. So something that, we've been discussing with EPA how to go about that. And, more likely it looks like we just have to, if we want to believe in that best practice, QA practice exercise, we need to add another level 2 standard. So something to, I don't know if others have heard about that already or have received comments from the QA office in Region 9. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Leroy. Yes, that's what you mentioned there is pretty important. What we do here is we have that one level 2 bench for that's maintenance and cal group, and we've got 6 level 2 fields. Before and after they go to EPA, we do a re-verification to make sure that 1, it's fit to go to EPA, and 2, it comes back in one piece, because a lot of times we have to ship to various regions that can accommodate us on our schedule. With Region 8, usually we can drive down, but if we have to ship to Region 7, because Region 8 can't accommodate us, or we have to ship to RTP, we definitely check it when it gets back. And although the requirement is every 6 months, we actually do every 6 weeks for our level 2 field, because we do ship our equipment a lot, and FedEx and UPS can be quite harsh. So in order to avoid using a level 2 that's been compromised, we do our re-verifications much more frequently. And that's true also with our audit level 3 fields as well. So yes, if you're a small organization, this will likely mean that you'll need to add a little bit more equipment in order to maintain the scheme that EPA had in mind.
These are really great questions. Very complicated, but I appreciate this diagram. It definitely helps in determining what the bench frequency is and the field frequency, and some, I guess, background information that's needed to help kind of clarify a lot of these questions. Any other questions from anybody else on the call? I just wanted to add, I did attach a document. It's a little dated. It's just options for tribes to meet independent performance evaluation requirements for the monitoring of NAAQS compliance. So it's an older document, but it's kind of a good little read as far as the why these performance evaluation audits are needed or required. So I would highly recommend you guys take a read through that. But if you're interested in implementing some of these independent performance audits, evaluation audits, or like, again, the federal audits, there's really three questions to ask is, again, it really goes back to why you're monitoring. Again, if you're monitoring for NAAQS compliance, this is really in the regulatory realm of monitoring, then these are required. And just how you're going to implement them, is it going to be self-implementation? Is there to opt for federal funding support to do that? Can you afford it? There's all these different questions when it comes to audits due to the funding mechanisms that provide support for these types of audits. I believe the funding comes directly as a STAG grant, but it's evenly distributed throughout all networks, monitoring networks, not just tribes, but also states and locals. So just keep that in mind as well. And the frequency of these audits, as Christian had highlighted, these audits can be very intensive and also on a very frequent basis to determine and provide that evaluation of the quality of the data that you're collecting. So is there any other questions? If not, I'd like to transition to our next presenter. I know we're getting kind of close to time. We may go over a little bit of time, but if you guys are willing to stick around, I appreciate it. But I want to say thank you, Christian, and I appreciate this really great overview.
No, thank you, Mike. And certainly this is not the end. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So I'd be happy to come back and give another presentation on more specific items as they come up.